Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Younger. I'm the research director of our project Ukraine and European Dialogue here at the IWM. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight on behalf of the IWM, and in particular our rector, Shalini Randeria, who couldn't make it tonight but sends her regards. Tonight's lecture, like the conference it's part of, has been a long time in the making, and the first thing I want to do before we go any further is to thank our partners who've helped make this possible. First and foremost, that's our institutional partners, the Ukrainian Institute and the Center for Urban History in Lviv, but also the team here at the IWM. In the room tonight, my colleagues Lydia Akrashova and Nikki Kshonzhak, who've made this possible. So thank you all very much. Tonight's lecture is the keynote part of our conference that's ongoing here at the IWM right now. Between Kiev and Vienna, Histories of People, Ideas, and Objects in Circulation and Motion. This conference is part of the wrap-up of a very full year of events in the framework of the bilateral cultural year, Austria-Ukraine 2019, which has been a wonderful occasion to bring lots of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian events here to Vienna, and we've all been very delighted to be able to take part in those. When we were thinking about this conference, we started from the premise that it's quite limiting to speak of Austria and Ukraine in a bilateral format, especially when the two countries have only existed in their current forms for a relatively short period of time. But connections between these countries are part of, and indeed typify, a broader history of movement across this space. So we've gathered over 30 scholars here at the IWM to rethink the history of this region through the lens of circulation and motion. And we're lucky enough that this keynote is actually in the middle of our conference after 2 wonderful full days of discussions, which will continue tomorrow morning, so you're welcome. We'll soon have the pleasure to hear from our speaker, Serhii Plokhii, but first I want to mention 3 ways you can continue tonight's engagement with the topic of Ukraine in an innovative way. The first of those is right here in this building. After the lecture, we'll have wine and cheese and a reception down in the IWM cafeteria. But in addition to socializing there, please feel free to explore the really amazing exhibition that's in the stairwell of the photography of Alexander Chekmenyov, curated by our friends Alisa Loshkina and Konstantin Akinsha. There's more information about the exhibition in the stairwell itself. Please feel free to take a leaflet. It extends all the way up to the 5th floor of the building. So please do feel free to explore. Secondly, I just want to quickly mention that tomorrow night at Moot at 8 p.m., you're warmly invited to a performance of East-West Street, a song of good and evil, based on Philippe Sand's book of the same name. It's a konzertante Lesung of image, narrative, and music about the lives of Raphael Lemkin, Herr Slauterpacht, and Hans Frank. And last but not least, we couldn't let Serhii and Philippe escape without putting them to work again. So on Sunday morning at 11 a.m. at Café Bookshop Singer near Schwedenplatz, we'll be hosting a conversation between these 2 recent Baillie Gifford Prize winners on the topic of humanity and catastrophe. Please do join us there. Now to the main attraction. It's a true honor to be able to introduce Serhii Plokhii tonight. He's Mykhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University and the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. His wide-ranging work has had a huge impact on all of us who deal with Ukrainian history, from the early modern period to the collapse of the Soviet Union and everywhere in between. He combines a remarkable talent for storytelling with an exceptional ability to synthesize complex historical developments. Because in addition to everything else he does, that he is also an astoundingly prolific writer, tonight he will not be talking about his latest book, which has come out since we invited him, and which tells a fascinating episode in the history of World War II, Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front. You'll find this book for sale at a book table in the reception area if you want to know more about that. Instead, we've asked him to reflect on his previous book, Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy, which came out in 2018. In a way, the Chernobyl environmental disaster is a crucial part of the history of circulation and motion between Kiev and Vienna and the spaces in between. And Serhii will tell us more about that. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Serhii for his lecture, tonight entitled Atomic Energy and the Arrogance of Man, Revisiting the Chernobyl Nuclear Disaster. Thank you, Serhii.
Well, Kate, thanks a lot for this wonderful introduction, and thank you to organizers of this conference for putting it together and also for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. And with Kate, we were just discussing how many years passed since she graduated from Harvard. We are now accustomed, as impeachment goes on, to see our graduates from Alex Widman to a number of others, and again, graduates are unescape. You can't escape really. You can run, but you cannot hide. And I'm really very pleased, Kate, to see you. Thanks. What I'm going to talk today is really related to my not latest book, but the book that certainly got a lot of attention, the book on Chernobyl. And I will try to reflect on the history of disaster in a little bit different way from the way how I do that in the book. The book is really, there is a story and there is an argument, and I will try to focus on argument at the expense of the story. So there will be no nail-biting kind of a situations, okay, whether the reactor explode or not and what will happen, whether this or that character would survive. So we'll skip that. And another thing that I'm going to do is to talk about Chernobyl in a quite broad international context. My book, and again, most of my work before that is, of course, focused on Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Soviet history, pre-Soviet. So it is, the book on Chernobyl is really very much grounded in the place and time. And place and time are both Soviet at that time. And it's sometimes very easy to dismiss the entire story of Chernobyl as something that was produced by a particular time and circumstances. And once communist ideology is gone, the Soviet Union is not there, and the bureaucracy that was responsible for that and particular culture allegedly is gone, we can move on. That's really something that belongs to the past. One of the arguments that I will be trying to make today, that again, Chernobyl, it's not only about the past. It is very much about our present, and I hope it is not about our future. And that's the argument of the story. And of course, the story of Chernobyl is international just in the way how it was happening. One of the observers at the time said that really the Cold War came, or at least the Berlin Wall, came to an end and became irrelevant with Chernobyl because radiation could cross boundaries. And before just coming here, I checked the latest data because again, we historians know the truth and it stays with us forever. Scientists keep changing their opinion. So the latest data is that 2% apparently of cesium-137, one of the most harmful isotopes produced by Chernobyl, landed up here in Austria. So that's just one of the examples of the international context. Another, of course, another important international part of the story is the fact that in Vienna since 1957, we have an international atomic energy agency, which was a very important part of certainly Chernobyl story, both in good way and in a bad way. And I'll talk about the both cases as we'll be moving on. And this is a slide to, the quality is not great, but the slide to illustrate the fallout of one of the isotopes in Europe. And as you can see here, this is the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, which is by now international by its nature. It's divided between Ukraine and Belarus. Even those 30 kilometers, they're divided. But this is actually much more proof of the international character of the disaster. Before we'll go into the parts of the Chernobyl story that I think relevant not just for the Soviet experience, but for the experience of the humankind with nuclear energy as a whole, I want to say a few words about what actually, or rather remind you about what happened in Chernobyl. So it was the night of April 26, 1986. It was a night shift that started at 12 a.m. And the expectation of those people were that the task that they were supposed to run during the previous day would already be done, would be gone, and the reactor would be shut down. The reactor was not shut down for a number of reasons. And less than 2 hours into that new shift, the reactor actually exploded. They lost control over it. Again, I'll talk a little bit later about exactly how that happened and what went into that. But there are different estimates. And again, the scientists are still arguing about the immediate causes of the explosion. This is now more than 30 years later. There are still theories appear that, okay, say there were 2 explosions, but which one happened, which one was hydrogen, which one was a different kind is still debated. How many isotopes and radiation was released is also still discussed, because that depends also, or this is closely related to the fact how much of that fuel, spent fuel, is now sitting in Chernobyl. The original data that was given by the Soviet Union was 5%, and it seems to me 5% is listed in my book. Since then, I kind of was digging a little deeper, and again, there is no consensus, but as the idea is being discussed of removing that fuel, they try to figure out how much fuel is there. And now the latest estimates are that over 50% actually escaped, and there is maybe 30% or something like that of fuel that is still there that would have to be extracted. But one way or another, within the next few days, the half of Europe was covered with radiation. And if the original response was denial on the part of director, on the part of operators, eventually the realization of what happened synced, and it was an enormous effort on the part of the Soviet Union at that time to deal with the consequences, and 600,000 people were mobilized to deal with that issue. Chernobyl had, of course, it's still today, in terms of the amount of radiation released, is the biggest nuclear catastrophe in the world. Fukushima got close, but not surpassed Chernobyl in that sense. And especially given that a lot of radiation released by Fukushima was really by the wind was moved to the ocean, and somehow we believe that radiation in the ocean is all fine and good. And radiation after Chernobyl really covered densely populated areas of Europe. That's another thing to consider. Now, some of you probably heard that in the last few years, Ukraine passed the so-called decommunization laws. Some of you heard, others maybe heard too much, others come from trenches of that war. We at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute tried to map the decommunization. And it was an interesting phenomenon in the sense that, as it can be predicted, there most of renaming and then first toppling the monuments to Lenin, and then renaming originally happened in central Ukraine. And then the rest of Ukraine, which is under Kiev's control, under the government control today. But on our map, there is also Donbass, and there is also Crimea. Because in March and in February of 2014, when decommunization or this acts of symbolic violence, toppling of Lenin's monuments started, Crimea and Donbass were still part of that space of Ukraine. So there are also points on our map which include Crimea and Donbass. There is just one area where decommunization never took place, and this is Chernobyl. And this is Chernobyl zone. And you can go there, you can see not only monuments to Lenin, you can also see the names of the streets, you can see the slogans that are there. And as I told earlier, it's now a kind of preserve, which is functioning in a very interesting way. It is preserved there about the particular disaster that had taken place, but it also preserved, it's a time capsule. That's where the Soviet Union, to a degree that is still alive physically, it is certainly very much alive there. And as I said earlier, it's really very easy to dismiss Chernobyl as a Soviet product and forget about it. Chernobyl was a Soviet product, but it also had a lot of things that are common for the development of nuclear energy in the world in general. After all, the Soviet Union was the one of the pioneers, together with the United States, in producing the bomb. Of course, some of that information was stolen, but then the very first functioning, small but functioning nuclear power plant was built in the Soviet Union. Technology was then later spread, including in Europe. So a lot of Soviet story is also the story of Europe and the story of the world. And in particular, the close interrelation between military program and the civilian program. And that's works in different countries in different ways. In the United States, first there was a bomb, of course, like it was in the Soviet Union, but there was also a realization of the danger that comes with the bomb. There was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there was a debate that started by people like Norman Cousins and others already immediately on the second week after the explosion. So there was this sense of a danger that came with that, and when then President Eisenhower in 1953 declared this program of atoms for peace, one of the reasons why it was there, not because US desperately needed another source of electricity, eventually it turned out that it was quite handy, but the main reason was to calm the American public and the public all around the world that nuclear things are not just the bombs that explode. There is some good and positive thing to the development of nuclear energy. So one way or another in the US they had to deal with the danger posed by nuclear, and that was part of public debate and discussion. In the Soviet Union that never happened. They were catching up. For them, for the people who built the bomb, who sacrificed very often their health, there was a wartime conditions. The idea was either we are catching up or we get nuked, and in that sense the beginnings of the nuclear energy and thinking about it were quite different, and the people responsible for creating of the bomb and creating of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster is actually the same people, and they happened to be here on this screen. I wonder if anyone can recognize any of these characters. Alexandrov would be where? Left. And this gentleman? Okay. It's interesting. So it's not easy, but it's possible to recognize Alexandrov, but it's impossible to recognize his boss. This gentleman's name was Yefim Slavsky. He was the most powerful minister that the Soviet Union had ever had. He was the minister of medium machine building, which was actually a Soviet Manhattan project that was going there in perpetuity. And Afanasyev, as the candidate for most powerful minister? Well, okay, we can discuss that. I still consider Slavsky to be the most powerful, but again, there can be room for again. I'm prepared to change my mind if the argument is good enough. Why I'm talking about Slavsky as a very powerful person? Well, Mr. Alexandrov was, of course, the head of the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He was also the director of the Institute of Atomic Energy. But the institute didn't belong to the Academy of Sciences. It belonged to Mr. Slavsky's ministry. So Mr. Velihov and others who worked under Alexandrov would actually go and knock on the door of Mr. Slavsky asking for money, asking for subsidy. Those two, they worked on the military application of nuclear power already in the late 1940s and early 50s. Alexandrov was the scientific academic director of the RBMK reactors, the graphite water reactors that turned out to be very dangerous, that were built in the Soviet Union. And of course, they were, the whole project was supported by Slavsky's ministry, and the first nuclear power plant that was built near then of city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, with RBMK reactors, it actually belonged to Slavsky's ministry. And only after that, it was turned to the Ministry of Energy. So again, the connection between military and civil, it's not so unique. In the United States, the most popular reactors, water reactors, are based on the reactors built for the nuclear, for the submarines. What, however, was part of culture in the Soviet nuclear industry, it was highly militarized. It was the conditions of the Cold War, of course. That information was highly classified and kept secret from people within the industry itself. And for Chernobyl, it had a very, very direct relation because the same type, physically speaking and technically speaking, the same type of accident as happened in Chernobyl in 1986 happened at the nuclear power plant near St. Petersburg in 1975. And it revealed for the first time in a major way problems that the RBMK reactors had. But that information actually was withheld from people in the industry. That was Ministry of Mr. Slavsky. The reactors went to the Ministry of Energy. That information never actually was discussed, never made available to the people who worked in Chernobyl. So their first reaction when that happened was that denial, and partially denial on the fact that they honestly didn't think that reactors actually can explode, that there can be a meltdown, despite the fact that one of those reactors already a few years before that, in 1975, was already on the, again, Chernobyl didn't happen there, but again, almost by accident. So the relation between military and nuclear, civil atoms for war and atoms for peace is there. The big question is how do you handle them? They're in the US, they're in the Soviet Union, they're in other places as well. And now we have a situation in which, of course, quite possible, and quite a number of countries already did that. That was India in particular, and now Iran is another possibility, is that it's the other way around, not from the bomb to nuclear power plant, but from nuclear power plant to the bomb. And the next frontier for the development of nuclear power is now the Middle East, the most volatile politically and otherwise area of the world, and that's where, okay, you still can hear me, yeah, and that's where the most of the new reactors are or will be built, or at least are projected to be built. Now let's talk to another important part of that story, which is again not unique for Chernobyl. And that story is about nuclear power and economy. And the fact that whether it was the Soviet Union or it was the United States or it was Japan, the reactors are there to produce electricity, so to produce in the market economy profit, and in non-market Soviet economy to produce, to meet the quotas and meet them in time before the end of the month, before the end of the year, and so on and so forth. And the Soviet Union was actually very aggressively developing nuclear energy, especially in the late 70s and early 80s. A few months before the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, 27th Party Congress, is it 27th? Yes, 27th Party Congress took place in Moscow. So it was March of 1986. The reactor exploded in April of 1986. And they adopted at that, Alexandrov was one of the speakers there, and they adopted the program for the development of energy sector in general, but nuclear energy in particular. It was decided that within the next 5-year plan, the number of the reactors that actually would be completed would be twice compared to the number that were completed and put online, connected to the grid in the previous 5 years. The reason for that, the 27th Party Congress was happening at the time when the word perestroika is not yet known. The key word, the key slogan at that time was ускорение, which means acceleration. So the belief was that basically everything is okay and right with the economic system, but you have to be younger, more vigorous, spend more than 3 hours in office like it was under Brezhnev, and also make right investments in terms of where the money go. And the key word was the scientific technological progress. That's what was supposed to save the Soviet system, lift it out of the decline in which it was at that time. And the embodiment of scientific technological progress was of course nuclear energy. So it's not only economic decision, it was also an ideological decision at the 27th Party Congress in terms of the rapidly expanding nuclear industry in the Soviet Union. And the reason was to meet the growing demand for energy. When some of the operators at Chernobyl were interviewed after the accident and they were asked, why did you do this and that, why you violated the particular safety rules that were there, they told more or less what I told you before, said, okay, we didn't know that things like that can happen. We didn't know that reactors explode. But the worst thing that could happen in our mind is that actually we shut down the reactor without good reason for that, because that would mean actually the loss, the economic loss. That was the worst case scenario for us. And our task was actually to keep reactor going and to keep reactor working. Otherwise, we could be fired. One of those operators who was interviewed, Kazachkov, said, well, of course, they wouldn't hire me just right away or for that particular reason, but they would find the way how to do that. So again, the economic, the production of electrical energy, that was the key. And for that you not just keep reactor going as long as possible, because that's exactly what was happening at Chernobyl as well. The way to increase productivity was to limit the number of days and weeks and months when the reactor is there for scheduled maintenance. So that was one of the ways to deal with that. But another way to save money is, of course, to cut corners in terms of the cost of the construction. And in the Soviet Union, there were two types of reactors. One that exploded in Chernobyl, another was more safe water reactor. But RBMK was a favorite one because it was cheaper to build it, and it was much more powerful. So the safer reactors were the reactors that were exported to other countries, in particular to Eastern Europe and to Finland. RBMK reactors like the one in Chernobyl stayed at home. There were numerous problems, of course, with the construction of the plant itself. Again, part of that was because of the saving money. Part of that was because of the way how the Soviet economy was functioning with shortages of everything. So if you don't have the right type of product or equipment or something like that on time, you go with what you got at that moment. And in Ukraine, they just published quite a huge volume of the KGB reporting on Chernobyl before the accident and after accident. And again, the good part of that volume is about the KGB officers in Chernobyl raising alarms about problems with the construction of the nuclear power plant. Again, Soviet story, but a story that is also global, because the reactors are there to make money, to make profit. They are now in a situation where the nuclear energy is not, after Chernobyl and Fukushima, they are not really the favorites of the societies as a whole. Some countries decide to go nuclear free altogether. So the industry as a whole is in a crisis. There is, of course, increasing pressures that are coming from renewables and from shale gas and other things. In Ukraine a few years ago, the workers were not paid and were going on strike. And Ukraine continues to be the home for the largest in Europe, and it seems to me in the world, nuclear power plant near my home city of Zaporizhia. So when it's the economy is a very important part of the nuclear industry, how it functions today, and especially when it functions under the kind of pressure that we have today. In the last 2 years, it seems to me the Westinghouse and another major company involved in nuclear went bankrupt, right? So these are not the best times for the industry. And again, at that particular time, it's really very important to keep in mind the pressures that economy, demand for profit or otherwise, have on that industry. This picture is here to demonstrate you again the way in which the money is being saved building nuclear power plants. So this is reactor number 1 that was built in the 1977. It seems to me it went online. This is reactor number 2. And these are reactors 4 that exploded and 3. So one way to save the money was that the machine hall that these reactors have, it's actually one and the same, which is certainly, you save money with that, but also there was an enormous danger that the fire, once it started on reactor number 4, that it would actually travel to all these other units through the machine hall, which was full of oil and so on and so forth. And then it was discovered that also the roof of the reactor was built out of stuff that was actually capable of burning. And from that point of view, the role of first responders, the role of the firefighters was extremely important. If the fire gets to other reactors, it doesn't mean that they automatically exploding or something terrible is happening. But short circuits is, of course, a very, very distinct reality, which means that the reactors could stay without outside power. And what happens when reactors stay without power? They don't have power to pump water, cold water to deal with overheated, of course, reactor. And then they go in meltdown. So the reactors without power, that's the story of Fukushima, basically. And that was a real danger. Another situation is here when it's the same really building. Again, it's cheaper to build, having a duplex as opposed to a standing alone home. So the same is with the reactors. And again, that eventually didn't result in any major problems with the third reactor. But again, that's another thing to consider. Again, the story is not just Soviet. Why Fukushima eventually exploded? Well, because it seems to me most, or at least quite a few of nuclear power plants in Japan are built on or close to the ocean shore, because they need a lot of water. You see here there was an artificial lake created, a cooling pond. In Japan, there was a problem with water, so the water that they were using as a cooling water, they were using the Pacific Ocean as a cooling pond, really, for their nuclear power plants. Again, it was more feasible and it was cheaper. Again, we see that in Chernobyl, but that's a bigger story. I talked already a little bit about the way that the nuclear energy and dangers of nuclear energy have been perceived differently in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And here I'll talk a little bit about this public perception of nuclear in two cultures and as represented by two films. One is, of course, 9 Days of 1 Year. Don't know how many people here may be of the right age to watch it, okay, or professionally interested. And with China syndrome, I guess more people are familiar with China syndrome. So the Soviet film was first. And it's Alexei Batalov is there, loosely based on the story of Kurchatov, who dies young as a result of allegedly overexposure to radiation. And very roughly, the story is that he is a nuclear scientist who was saving, it seems to me, a friend, was already irradiated. And then there is a love triangle. There is a woman that he loves, but it looks like she loves somebody else. Another scientist, and our hero gets really upset and does another reckless thing, again for some very good reason, and gets even more irradiated. And now they're preparing him closer to the end of the film for surgery, for operation. It's not clear whether he would die, whether he would live or not, but he got the girl. She decides that she will be staying with him. So he is rewarded for all these things, and the fact that he was again getting this radiation is viewed as a right thing to do, as the right act. Again, it's very much comes out of generally the nuclear science ethos in the Soviet Union of the 40s and 50s, where it is really the war. It is the war. We have to get the atomic bomb. We have to get the nuclear bomb. Otherwise, we will not survive the American attack. And that attitude, to a degree, I can do that no matter what, attitude continued. The China syndrome was released a few months before the 3 Mile Island accident in the United States. Pennsylvania is mentioned there, but it's a different story. Jack Lemmon is a key character there, and he works at the nuclear power plant, and he realizes that the company that he works for is in violation of all sorts of safety procedures. He is struggling because he is a company man, his loyalty to the company, but eventually he's concerned about the safety wins over, and he doesn't get to marry Jane Fonda, but he gets an interview with her. So he's the main protagonist, he is the main character, and that's again, I don't want to push this too far, but again, that's, in my opinion, at least based on what I looked at very much represents difference in culture. And that difference in culture in terms of that, okay, I can do certain things, I can take risks, was a very much part of Chernobyl story. You see here the there were altogether 6 people who were put on trial. It was a very Soviet trial in a way that it was an they called it an open trial in a closed zone. So theoretically anyone could go there, but to get to they held it not in Kiev, they held it not in Moscow, they held it in the closed zone, so you can't really get there. And now I mentioned already that Kiev volume of the KGB materials. We now know that those people, when they were in prison, the people who were in the same cell with them were actually agents, state agents who were reporting on them and trying actually to influence the kind of testimony that those people were given at the trial. And so this is the director of the plant, Mr. Brukhanov, who is portrayed as an embodiment of absolute evil in the mini-series. He was quite a decent man, by the way, at least on the basis of what I read about him. I didn't interview him. Another embodiment of evil was, of course, Mr. Dyatlov. And he was a decent man in his own right as well, but he was also someone who believed that he actually knew more than anybody else. He was very kind of a Soviet-type, tough manager. And the problem was that, of course, he didn't know a lot about the reactor. But this is Mr. Fomin, the chief engineer. The reason why Dyatlov believed that he knew more than anybody else was that both Brukhanov and Fomin, they came actually from before coming to Chernobyl, they never dealt with nuclear energy as such. So they didn't understand the physics of the reactor. They came from the coal-type power stations in Ukraine. Dyatlov, before he came to Chernobyl, he worked in the Navy in the Far East, but he worked with actually smaller reactors. And there is a significant literature, in particular dealing with 3 Mile Island, because there it was the former Navy men who were running the plant at that time. And there is significant body of literature discussing actually how small reactors behave differently from the big ones, and how the experience that you get at the small reactor, which is safe but is very different from the big, and how you can cause really a major accident. So there is a situation of the first generation of nuclear engineers. The younger guys who are coming up, they were already all trained. The top leadership is not trained at all. And this is something that one should keep in mind when we think about the expanding of nuclear in the Middle East or in any new area. And that's the type, how much experience the people who run those reactors are. But returning to the issues of safety, what Mr. Dyatlov, who was in charge of that test, and the test was, again, quite ironically, was there to improve the safety of the reactor. The question was that when they were shutting down the reactor and the emergency electricity the electricity to run the reactor was coming from reactor itself, from the turbine. So when they were shutting that down, then the emergency generation of electricity would start. But there was a gap of a few seconds, and they were looking for the ways of how to deal with that gap, experimenting whether after shutting off the reactor, the turbine still works for a while, for a few additional seconds that can produce that electricity. And they were trying to do that test before, but the equipment that they were using was not right. Now they had to do that. Well, for those of you who have remembered the Soviet Union or visited, The May 1st and then May 9 holidays were coming. That was their last chance to do a Friday night. Either they do that now, or they would have to wait for another 2 weeks or 3 weeks because, again, the right people would not be there, the permissions would not be given. The country was going on vacation, kind of Christmas vacation in the middle of May. They were actually pushing that to do that as soon as possible. And because the crew that came was not supposed to deal with those issues in the night, they were inexperienced enough. They lost the level of energy in the reactor. So the reactor was technically was actually down at that time. But that's when Mr. Dyatlov appears and actually orders to revive the reactor. The energy level was either low or zero or something like that. And in the process of doing that, they went under all the instructions and safety recommendations. They removed the absolute majority of the rods with which they control the reaction. It seems to me those were the boron rods. And once the reactor started to pick up power and energy level, there was not enough rods to regulate it. So it's a much more complex story. I tried to congest it, and also I'm a historian, not a nuclear physicist. But again, it's a much more complex story. In the end, they tried to shut it down. It was the scram button that they pressed, and it didn't work out because the core of the reactor was already overheated, and those rods, with the help of which they were trying to regulate it, they got melted and got stuck in the middle. Now, reactor exploded, and it wouldn't happen if there would be no violations of safety rules and procedures. All the systems were shut down because it was a test, but the argument that Dyatlov was making, which was quite correct argument, that with all of that, taking all of that into account, if the reactor would not have these design problems that it had, and there was a number of them, and again, the reactor was unsafe because it was graphite, and graphite, once it catches fire, the first time it happened in Britain in 1957, it's actually impossible, almost impossible to stop the fire. So whatever they were trying to do in Chernobyl, today's belief is that nothing of that really mattered. Graphite was burning there as long as there was graphite. And then the mass dissemination of that radiation, mass pollution, ended when graphite was not there anymore, when it got burned. So Dyatlov's position was, if the reactor was wrong, there would be no explosion. And both sides are right. So you have these two things to come together for Chernobyl type of explosion to happen. And again, that's something that most of the people today, especially who argue for the development, continuing development of nuclear energy, sometimes for very good reasons. Again, climate is a major concern. They forget the human component of that, the human story, because the argument goes, okay, there are no RBM car reactors anymore. There is a couple still running in Russia, but generally they're phased out. There is a new generation. It's much safer, and we can just forget about that and move forward. But again, that the human culture, the factor, and safety culture is really very important. And safety culture, again, that's something that can't be parachuted. That it is not something that can be taught. That's something that really develops over a period of time. So you can't just order it on Amazon. What is happening there? Okay, I still have some time. Probably that will be my final big point. and that's about the Soviet Union as authoritarian state. Again, important point given, I mentioned already the Middle East, and we certainly can talk about China, and we can talk about Russia today. Authoritarian states are very good at doing certain things, and they're terrible at doing other things. And the terrible thing that the authoritarian state was doing there is, of course, withholding information, first about the problems with the reactor from the people in the industry, and then withholding information on what happened there from the rest of the population. Authoritarian states are not the law-abiding and not the states in which people go according to the book. There is interesting comparison done between Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, and how the different governments and different political systems react differently to the disaster. And in the Soviet case, in the case of Chernobyl, it really doesn't matter what the laws and regulations are. What matters is the decision that is made at the very top. So anything that would happen in Chernobyl of any significance after the explosion would have to be approved or come from the very top. Once the government commission led by Sherbina, who is now Boris Sherbina, who was not much known, but now is known after the mini-series, comes there, Brukhanov and all this leadership, all this chief engineer and everyone else, they are removed. The decision to made formally removed later, but in reality they're not running the show anymore. The decision to evacuate Pripyat was made, not even Sherbina didn't have power to do that. He had to go all the way to the top. He says that it was the head of the Soviet government, Nikolai Ryzhkov, who gave permission to do that. So that's and once the Chernobyl happens, KGB cuts the telephone lines to the city. So the controlling information, that becomes the main task of the Soviet secret police at that time, with all sorts, of course, of consequences, with all sorts of spreading rumors. Well, probably the symbol of this disregard to the human health and fate of fellow citizens, it's of course the Kiev parade on May the 1st, 1986, where, at least according to the data that is available to me, Gorbachev personally orders Sherbitsky, the head of the Communist Party at that time, to do the parade, or you will put your party card on the table. At the moment when the levels of radiation are rising. Why it is done? Because the most important thing for the authoritarian state, it's prestige, and its prestige on the international arena. The most important thing inside is actually control over the population. And again, there are some delays with releasing information both in the US and in Japan, but they're quite negligent. The management behaves itself more or less the same how it behaves in Chernobyl. Like Brukhanov, for example, they're trying actually to give the best possible scenario to people up there, because they would be kept responsible for that. So there are very clear parallels on that level of management. But when you got upper, the decisions are very different. In Fukushima, the director of the plant actually was running the whole plant through the entire crisis that took, it seems to me, close to 1 week. At least there were 3 or 4 days they were exploding one reactor after another. They were not removed. When Prime Minister flew to the area, he was later accused of meddling, and actually that was used politically against him. Probably Gorbachev was afraid of that. He visited the nuclear power plant 3 years after the explosion, so no one could accuse him of meddling into those affairs, but all the key decisions were made at the very top. So this very bad things that come with authoritarian state, with control over the information channels, with the control of the population. There are also potentially good things that eventually turn not so good again in the authoritarian state. And that's something that has to do with this image. And it's the so-called roof cats, the people who are sent into most dangerous places. But no one, by the way, like in the mini-series, was threatening them to drop them from the helicopter or something like that. People were really felt that that was their responsibility. They were supposed to be there. The shift on whose eyes that whole thing exploded, they didn't want to go back. The first person who died from the radiation, again, he's not part of this pantheon of the firefighters, and his name escapes me right now. No. Well, the two people were dead as part of the explosion, but then when the liquidators were there. It's not Perevozhenko, it's something like that, but it's, again, I would have to consult my own book. But what happens there is that he is there on the first night. He got the level of radiation that was above than was permissible, despite the fact that it was almost from 5, they raised it to 25 rem. He goes to the hospital, and then he runs away from the hospital to join his crew and work there, and gets so it's really 9 days of 1 day Batalov type of a situation, just right there. That's where he is supposed to be. His health is secondary. Everything is secondary. So again, people who were related to the plant were really quite heroic. But altogether, as I mentioned, there were 600,000 people who were mobilized and sent into the most dangerous place on Earth at that time. One resource that the Soviet Union had and could control was people, and people were sent there. Today, we don't believe that actually that amount of people was needed. We don't, not just don't believe, we know that, of course, there was no monitoring of the health of what was going on there. There were major problems even with getting information on how much radiation those people would get. So again, we deal with the same ability of the authoritarian state of mobilizing resources, sometimes quite effectively, of the entire country. And this mobilization of the resources is happening not just at the expense of the population, but it actually harms the population. And so from that point of view, again, maybe there is just one monument to Lenin left in Chernobyl, and the communist as ideology is not going through its best days possible. But Chernobyl, again, it's not just about ideology. It's not just about the Soviet Union. It's also about the forms of government. It's about culture. It's about economy and economic development. I guess I will skip. No, I will not skip. I'll say a few words and then I'll conclude. And I can. That will be a teaser. You can ask me more about those slides that I didn't have much time to talk about. We don't know whether this curve actually, has anything to do with Chernobyl or not. The photo was taken in the Narodichi area near Chernobyl, the area which is not part of the 30-kilometer zone. But the 30-kilometer zone is quite deceiving in a sense. There are areas that are as clean or maybe cleaner than Vienna within 30-kilometer zone. They're very dangerous and very dirty ones, and it all depended on the direction of the wind. And there are very dirty areas outside of the zone, and Narodichi was one of them. And once the story of Narodichi became known, journalists, when their films were done, and the attention was attracted to the impact of Chernobyl on human health, on our ecological system. And till today, it's more than 30 years later, we really don't know what should be attributed to Chernobyl, what not. the number of people who died from acute radiation syndrome, we know the number. It's, again, it's dependent on how count, between 30 plus and 50 plus, but a relatively limited number. 2 people died as the result of the explosion per se. But other, you can Google, and the data would be between 4,000 or 5,000 additional deaths to norm, to 90,000, which means we really don't know. And what is Chernobyl from the point of view, scientific point of view, in terms of the fallout? It's the fact that low dosages of radiation have on human and on plants and so on and so forth, on animals, over a long period of time. We know a lot about nuclear bomb because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What the significant amount of radiation released over a short period of time has on the human being. And we know that not because it's easier to understand or more obvious, but because there was a major international study done for a long period of time to assess what is happening there. That study was never done on Chernobyl, partially with the help of the Vienna-based international atomic agency, energy agency. The program was promoted by the UN Health Organization, but in the UN pecking order, UN Health Organization is actually less significant than International Atomic Energy. And International Atomic Energy is there responsible for 2 things at the same time: for promoting the peaceful use of nuclear energy and for controlling and policing that industry at the same time. So there is just a conflict of interests inbuilt in the industry, in the agency itself. And this is actually our best hope today. That agency is our best hope, because I'll go there and maybe stop here. I will not talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, because that is a big part of the book. I can talk about that if you ask, but that's a little bit outside of my kind of international impact of Chernobyl. So they this year just finished the construction of the new sarcophagus, of the new shelter. The price tag is, it seems to me, 1.5 billion. Mostly paid not by the countries that actually were part of the Soviet Union and technically can be kept to different degree responsible for what happened. Russia contributed something like 60 million. Kazakhstan, it seems to me, 1 or 2 million. Ukraine contributed a lot, partially not in monetary form, but in other forms. But the main money actually came from Europe, from Japan, and from the United States. The nuclear disaster and its consequences is just too big of a disaster for a country like Ukraine, for example, today, or Belarus, that shares doesn't share the reactor, but shares the exclusion zone. It's too big of a thing to deal with. So at the end of the day, with Chernobyl's, it's the international community as a whole picks up the bill for that. And that raises very important questions about the uses of nuclear energy, because it's a sovereign state of an independent state to decide whether they want or don't want to build nuclear power plant. It's in certain circumstances is a big boost to economy. For the Western countries, or for the countries of the former Soviet Union, to go to the third world countries and say, okay, we don't want to build nuclear power plants because we don't know, you got the wrong culture and you got this and that. Well, that would be super selfish. It's after the West and the First and the Second World developed their nuclear industry and had this accidents. So there is a sovereign right to build the plant, but when something goes wrong, and gets, of course, processed from there. But if something goes wrong, it's actually the community, the world community as a whole, that pays price for that. The nuclear disasters, they turn to be international. Again, Japan is on the island, and US is a big country, so that's a little bit different. But Chernobyl shows the international reach of those disasters, and we have really no other choice but to strengthen that agency that you have here in Vienna, but also to think about the way in which one part of the agency doesn't cancel the efforts of the other, because there is an inbuilt conflict of interest. I will probably stop here. I used all of my time. I hope I used it well, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Serhii, for this lecture that put the Chernobyl disaster in its bigger context, in its international context, in its political context, and across time and space. So we do have time for a few questions before we go downstairs for wine and cheese. So what we're going to do, what I would suggest we do, if you don't mind, is collect 3 questions. You can then take those, and then we can see if we have time for another round. Mm-hmm. So, Lydia.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. My name is Ian Bates, and I'm a visiting fellow here.
Hello,
we know each other, journalist based in Ukraine. The question I want to ask is, how much of this danger and destruction do you think is innate in building these sorts of reactors? And I don't mean in terms of the technology. You know, what you're talking about is that there are political demands to get things done quickly. There are reasons to cut corners. There was a desire to, produce something. And in that sort of environment, you're trying to move ahead quickly and you're trying to get rid of things. I'm thinking a little bit of Kate Brown's book, Plutopia, as well, where she's looking at different reactors, but where you have similar issues in the US and in the Soviet Union, where you reward people because it's dangerous work, you give them better creature comforts. Pripyat is the same thing, but at the same time, it seems like these accidents happen over and over again because of the pressure and cutting corners to make it happen. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Okay.
Give me a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. William Spiegelberger. I'm a lawyer here in Vienna. To what degree do you think the current regime in Russia differs from the Soviet regime in its handling, say, of bad news? And we have two recent examples. I think one was Ozyorsk. That's Mayak.
Yeah, there were, again, we never figured out what happened there, and then there was, of course,
and the one in the north, Yonovsk, by Arkhangelsk. The question is simple: Are we dealing with the same basic entity when it comes to disasters, or have we made progress or gotten worse?
Okay.
Thank you for a great lecture. My name is Olha Martanyuk. I teach history at Kyiv Polytechnic Institute. And I've been thinking about the legacy of Chernobyl in Ukraine and the development of nuclear infrastructure after Chernobyl. Ukraine is still a very nuclear country. 52% of energy is produced at nuclear power stations. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapon, but Ukraine never built its nuclear cycle. Ukraine does not extract uranium. Ukraine does not enrich fuel. Ukraine does not have storages to store the nuclear waste. And Ukraine has been very much connected with Russia since the Soviet time. And it seems like it has been connected after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my question, did Ukraine actually learn a lesson from Chernobyl, or is it just a big exception that did not really influence the way Ukraine develops its energy sector? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I'll start with the accidents and nature of accidents, and there is big literature on that. One of the directions in which that literature goes is the so-called normal accidents. And the argument there is that in the complex enough systems, in particular technological systems, you really can't predict all eventuality. So these things will continue happening. So you really have to try that stuff to see how it works. And in nuclear case, again, in the case of nuclear energy, if it's an explosion, to take that kind of risk. But as things become more and more complex, those things are almost inevitable. Other line of argument is that no, that's the problem with all these reactors that exploded was that the mantra of the 1950s was that the best reactor is the simple one and the cheapest one, and that's wrong. So there are these disagreements, but most people are talking about the nuclear disaster, like any disaster, happening at the intersection of nature or technology and human systems. And most of what people in sciences or in history we're dealing with that part of the human component of the story. And that's what I was trying to a degree also to focus on. But again, if you believe in normality of accidents in the complex systems, fasten your seatbelts. Yeah, we are for quite a ride. Now, regarding Russia, the short answer is I don't know. And the longer answer is that my understanding is quite superficial, is that some things are changing, other things are staying the same. So, and what I will say is based basically on the coverage of this accident near Arkhangelsk. Again, because of me working on Chernobyl, I was very interested in what I will see, what is being said by the government, what is being said by people, what is on TV. And one thing that I saw, oh my gosh, they show on TV, there are the people who are dressed already in protective uniform, who care for the potential patients, people who were irradiated. They're driven to Moscow. The cameras are there showing how they're brought to the hospital to be dealt with. Very different from Chernobyl. No one had any equipment. No one had, and then there was complete blackout in terms of the information. Even when the first firefighters who were dying, they were burying them. They were actually trying to do that in secret, with media being not present there and so on and so forth. So my first impression was, okay, a lot changed for the better. But then later came reports that also those people who were brought to the hospitals by well-equipped people, they were left there with the personnel, with doctors, with nurses who were not trained, were not protected, who allegedly, I don't know, were irradiated or not, but it's very easy to be irradiated from a person who got a higher dosage of radiation. Again, the case with Ozyorsk, really there was no straightforward explanation and answer what happened. So my overall assessment on the basis of this, again, very, very fragmented information, that certain things are changing. But I don't think that the deep elements of the culture, which is of nuclear industry, which is Soviet, that they can be changed. And again, reaction that was in the media to the mini-series was again, I understand, quite negative. Partially, again, judging by the coverage, partially because there was a concern that film on Chernobyl undermines the credibility of Rosatom, and Rosatom is competing with the American and French firms and so on and so forth. So this is bad news for the industry, which means bad news for Russia. So again, I think it's a mixed bag, but to a degree that there is a change, it's a change in the positive direction. Now, with the with Ukraine. Whether Ukraine learned a lesson? No. No. You know that 52% of Ukrainian electricity comes from nuclear. How many people in Ukraine know that? How many people actually discuss that? The way how Chernobyl functions in Ukrainian memory, in Ukrainian society, it's basically, my understanding is now in terms of the significance, it's on the level with Holodomor, with the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33. That's where the entire nation mourns its victims and its history, the very tragic moments of history. But what that means is Chernobyl is in the past, right? That was an awful thing that was done in the Soviet Union. It was under the direction of Moscow. We turned the page, but we didn't turn the page. We first turned it and then unturned. So the parliament that was declared independence of Ukraine, that was also the parliament that voted for shutting down of a number of construction sites. There was no nuclear power plant built in Crimea. There were already works and preparation done. No in Chernihiv, the frozen, not in Chernihiv, in Cheherin. There was frozen construction of the nuclear reactors in Rivne and in other places, Khmelnytsky. But come early 1990s, a terrible economic situation, and the very same parliament, the very same people actually vote the other way around. And that's the question of safety versus economic benefit or economic necessity in the conditions of Ukraine of the 1990s. And today, we have a lot about Chernobyl discussion, but about victimhood, right, associated with 1986. Chernobyl is about the past. There is nothing about today or tomorrow, and that has to be discussed, especially in the current conditions. You mentioned again that infrastructure is not there. Yeah, infrastructure was built during the Soviet times. The fact that there is a war between Russia and Ukraine means that at least for a while, I don't know what is happening now, but there were reports that the spent fuel was not sent to Russia anymore, so it had to be sent somewhere else. There were discussions about turning the exclusion zone into a dumping ground for the nuclear waste from the entire Europe and entire world. So these things are still going on. So it's a major problem. Another report was, it seems to me, 1 year ago, year and a half, that there was one of the computer viruses, apparently according to a report coming from Russia. So it knocked down some of the equipment on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Sorry?
A lot of equipment in Ukrainian nuclear power plants is Russian.
Well, again, I don't know whether it is related or not, because again, once the virus is there, it's very difficult to control it. So that's another big problem. And again, we are in the conditions of cyber warfare generally in the world, whether the war is declared or not. And that's another very dangerous component that was not there when the nuclear industry was developing. If you can sitting somewhere far away to cut off electricity from a nuclear power plant, and that's apparently is possible today. Then you get a nuclear, not exactly a nuclear bomb, but something pretty close to nuclear bomb in your backyard. So it is an issue of safety that wasn't there, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, but it is now there, related to the cyber warfare.
All right, we have time for 3 more quick questions
Sure.
and answers, and then we'll wrap up.
Cultural manager from Basel. We had a festival on Chernobyl, on Ukraine in 2004. My question is towards your economic arguments, or are there real rational arguments to say that in the end of the day a full cost picture is actually economic making sense, or counting in a full cost calculation which includes eventualities and catastrophes, is it still then is it still a good idea for this world, knowing that we need a lot of energy, but is it a good way of looking for it there?
Sure, thanks.
Hello, I'm Walter Zimmerli, and I was very pleased by especially the beginning of your lecture and now the turn the discussion is taking, because now you're reaching the second part of your title. You call it arrogance. Being a philosopher, I probably would call it hubris. Probably is the same thing. And I want to just start with a confession. Being a philosopher, I owe a large part of my career to Chernobyl. Because in '86, when I was a very young professor of philosophy in Germany, my phone rang and the editors of the magazine Der Spiegel was on the phone, and they asked me to write the lead article in Der Spiegel on Chernobyl, a philosophical lead article. And of course, then I didn't really think about it. Of course, they could have asked more senior persons. Why didn't they do that? Well, they were afraid they wouldn't write it. And they were probably right. So
now I know that.
yeah, right. And the article was titled a farewell to responsibility. And the philosophically interesting question is, which my friend and colleague Ulrich Beck afterwards, from more social sciences point of view, called the problem of the risk society. Is it, regardless whether it was the Soviet Union or the US or Great Britain or whatever, is it possible to really apply our traditional notions of responsibility to a catastrophe like this? You said yourself that it's not a question where a single state could take responsibility. You know, the world community has to take responsibility. And I think that's exactly what the hubris part is, because nobody thought probably about that.
Right.
And I think they are not even thinking about that today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Why don't you just take those two and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, sure. Well, in the way how I will be answering these questions, the two are related. And one thing that the actual cost of the electricity that is produced by nuclear energy, it's overall it's a very expensive undertaking that could start there under particular conditions where the government was interested in doing that and building, in particular in the Western world, without government encouragement and guarantees, the private capital would not be investing into the industry that didn't know what the outcome was. So that was an industry both in the Soviet Union and the US and everywhere else highly subsidized. So when the argument is today that, well, in some places the renewables is cheaper than nuclear, that's because there are government tax breaks and other things. Probably this is right, but it's also right for the early age in the nuclear industry, even more maybe right. Some countries keep going with the nuclear because you need infrastructure, you need to train people, and this is related also to the nuclear weapons. At least that's one of the arguments that is made. Don't know how true it is in case of United Kingdom. So there was also always a government, which means money, public money, that was there, and the cost is not limited just to that. The cost is also the cost of maintaining this graveyard, this construction, multi-billion-dollar construction, is there only for 100 years. But still, even there, it has to be serviced. There have to be people. They have to go there. There is even if the nuclear plant is doing fine and good, once it comes to the end of its life, it's enormous cost to dismantle it and deactivate. And then nobody figured out what to do with the spent fuel. So the idea is, yes, we know technologically we can put that into the rock somewhere, but the moment the place to house that is built in the US, there is a mass. No one wants to have that in their backyard. So, and we still don't know what to do with that. So that's an issue there. And finally, something that links these two questions together, but in a little bit different way, not philosophical, but the question of responsibility. Maybe I will be off $1 billion or $2 billion, but as far as I remember, the current claims escapes me now, the name of the Japanese company that was running the Fukushima. Yes, so it's of course went bankrupt a long time ago. Now it's the Japanese taxpayers who are picking up the bill. But the claims related to the harm done to the land, to the dislocation, to all these things, it seems to me $200 billion. This is the biggest claim that is there. So, which means that at the end, it's the taxpayers will have to decide whether they own or what do they do with those claims, because it's not just about the bankruptcy of the company; it can be the bankruptcy of the country, or at least the country can go through hardship. So, and one of the arguments that is there, that in the law-abiding democratic society where such claims can be made, that society can't afford really nuclear accidents. Again, no one is suing anybody in the former Soviet Union, right? And probably that's another great thing about authoritarian states, right? The law doesn't apply. But outside of that, it's a legal nightmare. It's the kind of responsibility, again, that the individuals as society are not prepared to deal with. And again, I can't really respond to your question in broader philosophical terms, but I'll try to do that in the way how I understood the psychology of people who were involved in that. One of the chapters in my book is called Denial. And denial was there for a number of reasons once the reactor exploded. For a long period of time, they refused to believe in that. And one part of the story was that they were really not taught at the polytechnics or institutes that such things happen. There was not in the instructions. But another thing was, on my shift, the reactor exploded, and the world is coming to an end as far as I know that. What do I do with that? And I'm responsible for that. So the only psychological refuge is actually deny what you even see. So there was a combination of these two things that came together, and again, that was certainly also a major factor in, first of all, reacting to the reality there, but also spreading the information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One more time. And let's
Thank you.
Thank you. And you are all warmly, and I mean that literally, unfortunately, welcome downstairs in the cafeteria for wine and cheese. Thank you.